After the 2016 election, during the presidential transition, I spoke with a number of outgoing Obama administration officials about their surprise at the result of the 2016 election and about the worst case scenario that the country should prepare for. The worst thing that they could imagine, having been in government, that the incoming president could do, particularly given the kind of things that he had promised and threatened to do while he was running as a candidate in 2016. I don't know what I expected to hear in terms of a sort of, doomsday scenario for what a president could do if he had the worst possible intent and a maximalist impression of presidential power. I don't know what I expected to hear from outgoing Obama administration officials, but the answer that I got surprised me. The answer that I got was that the worst case scenario they could imagine was that the president, the incoming president, Donald Trump, would use the Justice Department as a weapon. That is the single most dangerous thing that a president could do to the country on his own say-so. If he could figure out a way to tame the U.S. Justice Department and turn it into an instrument to help himself, turn it into something that helps his allies and hurts his opponents, the awesome power of federal criminal prosecution and federal criminal investigation should be seen as essentially a domestic nuclear bomb from an ill-intentioned president. That was the warning that I got from Obama administration officials when they were on their way out the door. And that's apparently what we've got. And it appears to be wholesale and not even undercover when it comes to the incredibly important prosecutor's office in D.C. But if it's New York, too, if it's SDNY, too, then I don't know where else we're supposed to look for an entity that can stop this, that has the strength to stay independent, that can and will stand up and stop what's happening from happening. I mean, there's a reason this is being called a rule of law emergency. This is exactly that.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.